The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. This is Chris Sinclair, Executive Director of the Association of California Symphony Orchestras, and greetings from AXO World Headquarters in Sacramento, and from Paul, who's in Pasadena. Paul is one of AXO's most active board members, having been a chief architect, I've always wanted to say that, of annual conferences for the past 3 years at least, and this year's no exception. You all can expect a fantastic program this year, and we hope to see you in Costa Mesa. The fact that Paul's turned the Pasadena Symphony and Pops around is a testament to his belief in personal leadership and creating the healthy organization culture he's going to speak about today. Before we get into our webinar, I want to let you know that we're going to keep the lines closed as we go through the slides. Paul will be answering questions as you type them in, and then the email you received earlier this morning gave you instructions on how to do that. If you all have any questions, please call Caroline at our office at 916-484-6744. So looking forward to this, Paul. Shall we get started? Paul, you need to unmute yourself.
There we go. All right, thank you very much. Sorry, that's the biggest issue is technical issues here. So hopefully everyone can hear me. And as Chris said, I'd be happy to take questions as we go along here. This managing culture is about that. We're going to talk about technical HR issues, which is the law, but the law really changes so much, and there's so many changes to HR details. It varies by state, and certainly there's a statewide rule, and then there's also the national rule. But because that changes so much, we're really going to focus mainly today on how to build a culture within your organization so that the legalese part sort of takes care of itself. Really, I think the major issue here is building a culture within your organization so that you don't have to really rely on the legal issues of HR. I've had a lot of experience hiring and terminating staff over the years, for good or bad, and have learned a lot through the way. So hopefully I can share a few things with you, and by the end at least there'll be some, maybe a handful of takeaways. So let's get started here. Basically, what we call about human resources is the human part of it. And I think we often forget that. We often think it's human resources is a legal issue or some sort of organizational issue, but it really is about human beings. And so we're going to focus on the hiring, the managing, and terminating of people, and that includes in our organizations staff, both artistic and administrative. But I'd also really like to add that board and volunteers we should treat the same way, because there is a hiring of a board, hiring of a volunteer, and we shouldn't think, especially with volunteers, that because we don't pay them that they don't fall into the same kind of category. And then last, really, some of these culture building tools would help you in your personal life too, I hope. So we'll talk about 3 different divisions here. One is the personal leadership in creating the culture that I've been talking about. The second is how you can do that from an organizational standpoint, and then actually when it comes down to team selection, what does that mean? And then the last part of it is the policies that I was mentioning, the sort of the legal part of it. And these tools really can be used whether you're the CEO or you're a manager or you're a department head or even within your own little team. So it doesn't really mean you have to be the head of the organization to be able to utilize this. So the first part, the personal leadership in creating culture. very interesting quote from Dale Carnegie: when dealing with people, remember you're dealing with creatures of logic, not with creatures of logic, but creatures of emotion. Emotion is the biggest issue when dealing with HR issues. Emotion then leads to communication or miscommunications and can really get you in trouble pretty quickly. So creating the culture, where do you start with creating culture? For those who are leading organizations, really this starts with the board chair. Anytime that I go in to consult with an organization or even am looking at a job for myself, the first thing I want to do is make sure that the board chair and I are on the same page, because if you don't have the board chair on the same page, then you're going to constantly be fighting that, and that's not going to be helpful. No matter how successful you might be as far as suggestions and implementing things, if you don't have the board leadership on board, then it's going to be a disaster. The next thing really is to focus on the staff. Do you have the right people? Whether your staff organizing or reorganizing, maybe you have a staff structure that could be reorganized in a better way. And then really the third thing is, when you create a culture, you have to do it in a very holistic way. You can't just change a piece of it. You can't just change one person on the team. You can't just change, many of the departments. So depending on how large your organization is, this could take some time, but it doesn't work unless you have this holistic approach to it. So with culture and creating culture or reorganizing it comes change. And as we've heard many times before, no one likes change. So what I'd suggest, especially if you're coming in new to an organization, to change the culture right away. That would be the first thing you do, to set up expectations, to set up the details, because once you are in an organization for a while and then you start changing things, people wonder why all of a sudden you're changing it. They get settled into how you do things or how you've allowed things to continue to happen, and it's really hard to do that. So I really suggest going in and changing right away. When we talk about culture, one of the things that could be a way of operating or a way of communicating. For instance, you could say, well, staff members aren't going to talk to each other. We're going to talk to each other. We're not going to email each other issues. And it can also be a culture of interaction. How does everyone interact? So those are some ways that you can change culture. There's a book called 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, and I have it at the end of this presentation here, the author and everything. You can take it down. But this book, if you haven't seen it or haven't read it, I'd strongly suggest you read it. And as a matter of fact, a colleague of mine, I suggested he have his staff read it and talk about it, and it has really changed them. I just saw him the other day, and it really has changed and moved them forward as a team. They talk about 5 dysfunctions of a team, and I've kind of switched it here and made it positive, 5 functions of a team. The first function is really to make sure that everyone trusts each other. And you can respect someone for what they do, respect who they are, but you may not trust them. But it's really important for everyone to trust everyone and be vulnerable to each other as a staff and board. I'm talking about the entire organization, because once you have that trust and you believe that everyone is coming at it from a organizational standpoint, objective standpoint, then you can start talking about conflict, start challenging each other. And then that conflict hopefully is resolved and becomes team commitment, and that team commitment then is checked with accountability, and then hopefully through all that you achieve results. And that's sort of the gist of this book, and I again really suggest it as a way to start talking about culture and to start moving your culture forward. And I've also done this with another book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, and we've had the staff read a chapter a week, and for 9 weeks we talk about level 5 leadership and all the things that are here on your screen. And it really helps because you can address issues in a very objective way through a book and that everyone's reading, rather than say, well, you marketing manager aren't doing your job this way or communicating properly, it's a really great way to, again, talk about culture in an objective way and start having challenging conversations. Level 5 leadership is basically a leader who is really focused on the organization and not him or herself. And you can have a level 5 leader at every level. It doesn't, again, mean that you have to be head of the organization to do this. The first who, then what is about getting the best people who can adapt to situations. I think that this is really important because you can have someone who's very skilled, but if they're not adapting to change, especially in our business where change is constant, then you don't have the right person on board. The brutal facts, which we can all learn from, to really attack them rather than ignore them. And then, this hedgehog concept is being diligent and hardworking and so forth. So I won't go through all of this, but it's another great way to use an objective tool to change your culture. So the next area that we talked about generally culture is organization focus and team selection. I've been using 6 mantras for our organization. I think this really works for almost any organization. I mean, some of the ones in the middle may change, but the first thing is no asshole rule. This no asshole rule actually was a Harvard Business Journal article by a Stanford professor that wound up becoming a book. And the gist of it is these professors were looking for replacement for their department and found that there were many professors who were amazing people. They had great articles. They would bring star power to the department, but they were a jerk. And so they realized that they'd rather have someone who is maybe not as amazing from star power standpoint, or have a person who's star power and also is a nice person. So we have certainly adapted that here and continue to, and that kind of falls into the next one, which is no drama. We all have baggage, we all have our personal lives, but we really want to make sure that that drama is at the door when you come to work, because we're here for the organization, we're not here for our own personal issues. This is not therapy session. And then the other two are more for arts organizations, butts and seats, dollar in the door. The return on investment issue is really not only return on investment financially, but return on investment from a human resource standpoint. So, if you have your whole team working on X project and it only results in not much return, then you might want to relook at whether you want to do that project again. And then the last thing is entrepreneurial spirit. I really feel like, we need as organizations to be fast and address the market, but also be strategic and thorough at the same time. So hiring, I think this is really where it all starts. And if you do the right hire, and if you do it in the right way, then you'll avoid issues later on, or at least you'll minimize them as much as possible. The first thing is, to have a job description and be really clear about what skills are required. For instance, if you're hiring a finance director or someone in finance, they should be able to analyze a profit and loss statement on the spot and tell you, what's going on. I mean, that's a very practical thing. If you have very specific skills you need, then you should test them as opposed to just see if they're nice people or if their resume, matches what you need. The other thing that I've been finding really helpful over the years is this character assessment. So maybe you have a really great person on paper, and maybe you've even interviewed them, and you want to find out more. For good or bad, social media tools are a great way to check that out. I often go on Facebook, even before, actually I've been doing this now, even before I interview, to see what kind of person these applicants are. And it's amazing, unfortunately, what kind of photos and what kind of conversation happens on their own public Facebook pages that gives you insight into who they are, who they might be for you as an employee, and how they might represent the organization. The other thing is interview process. I think it's really important to be very consistent, ask the same question so that you have an apples-to-apples comparison at the end and there isn't any favoritism. You might even want to have a third person in the room so that you have an objective third party listening and giving you feedback after the interview. One of the things, especially in the interview process, I know a sort of a favorite question is, tell us a challenging situation or a successful situation. I like to ask a different question, which is, describe a situation that felt unfair. Because if they answer what is unfair, first of all, it takes them a second. I think it stuns them. But when you hear what is unfair, you get real insight into what makes them tick. The flip side of that question is, describe a situation that you felt was extremely fulfilling, so that you also know, again, what makes them tick on a positive way. And then certainly the other couple things, the background check, a police background check, and then maybe a physical, if they're lifting or if they're a stage manager or have, things that require physical, a physically fit person, then you can certainly have that done. So once you've hired someone, the managing is really important. Even the first day they come to work, their desk should be clean. There should be a welcoming atmosphere, a little orientation, and then checking in with them every day is really important so that you don't get so busy. I mean, we're all busy, but I think taking the time to meet with your team, no matter who that team is, address issues as they happen rather than waiting for an evaluation every year and saying, well, this is how you screwed up the last year. There really should be no surprises in evaluation time. And then, again, defining clear expectations, whether that's through the job description or further, define the timeline, what needs to be done, and so forth. And then the document is really leads us into the next area, which is the discipline and termination. Suppose you have employees who are...
Excuse me.
Yep.
It's Chris. I just have a quick question before you move on. Is this Facebook checking kosher?
Yeah, it's public. That's the interesting thing.
Okay.
Is that it's public, and so I think many people say be careful what you post, be careful what pictures are out there. I think it's a great way, again, whether you've already interviewed or you're going to interview someone, it's a great way to understand what makes them tick, and then decide if that person fits within the culture that you have or you want to create. I mean, that means some really crazy things. We're not talking even about, slight things. I mean, it's pretty extraordinary what people post on their Facebook pages, and can give you a insight as to how they spend most of their time or what they feel is important even in their life. So, I mean, it's obviously very subjective, but it's a public forum, and employers have been using it for quite some time.
Okay, thank you.
So then discipline and termination, if you do have issues, and by the way, I don't see any questions, so again, feel free to ask along the way. I'm trying to monitor here with my my handy-dandy IT knowledge, which is about 0. Anyway, discipline and terminations, if there are issues, really address them right away. Don't let them, as human beings, we don't like conflict, or most of us don't like conflict. While we'll complain about the employee or the issue, we rarely address those issues, especially address them immediately before they become bigger issues. And I can't tell you how this is helpful. If you address it sooner than later, it'll just be much easier all the way around. Let's see. I see a question. Oh. All right. No, if you can make changes anytime. The question is, if you didn't make changes at the beginning, is it all lost? No, but it's just going to take more time, and it's more difficult. So with discipline, you've got to go through a process, because especially here in California, the state of California is very employee-friendly and not employer-friendly. So you really have to make sure you've done all the steps to be able to rehabilitate as much as possible the employee before you terminate him or her. So that's reminding them of your expectations. And you start with verbal conversation rather than going right to written, because once you start writing up things, employees get nervous. But having a conversation about how they could do a better job. I mean, whatever the situation is. If that's not helping, then going to a written situation where, again, I would also suggest having a third party in the conversation, saying, look, we've talked about this. This is what I expect. This is the timeline I expect it. And these are the consequences if it doesn't get fixed. And then once you get into that written situation, then the employee knows that that's more serious. And you have to really be careful, because if you have an explosive employee and you get to that written situation, you may have them sabotage the organization during their time that they're trying to be fixing themselves. I had one employee, we'll get to that later, but again, a clear timeline of improvement and witnesses there. Hire slowly. If there could be a takeaway, hire slowly and fire quickly is really important, because if you hire slowly, then you'll do your due diligence in getting the right person on board, and hopefully that you've done everything you can to ensure that that's a right person. And then if you're finding a person or an employee is really not doing his or her job the way you should be, and it's really bringing down the rest of the organization, you should really take care of that very quickly and not let it drag on, because you may lose some other great employees who don't want to put up with the timeline. And then make sure you are also documenting everything, every decision you do, making sure it's objective, because you may have an employee come back to you and say you got rid of them for some sort of discrimination issue, whether that's it could be anything, and this could be made up, and it doesn't matter whether it's made up. But if you have it documented, you'll minimize your exposure. And then I also would document, if you think the employee is not qualified, why is that, and really make it as detailed as possible. So let's see. Next area is the risk management and the policies, sort of the nuts and bolts of this. Really, out of all of the rules and regulations, there's some pretty basic underlying themes. And one is the golden rule theme, which is do unto others as you would like, done unto you, so to speak. I mean, to treat people fairly and equitably. This equitable and fairness runs throughout all of the human resource legal issues. Once you start treating people unfairly or especially unequitably, so you give, for instance, one person 10 days of vacation, you give somebody else 5 days of vacation, unless that's but they're at the same level, they're the same kind of staff person, that's inequitable, and that is a breach of HR, of an HR situation. So fair and equitable really comes down to most of the laws and rules that you'll see later. And then whatever you say during your work time, be careful what you say. Even if things are simpatico and everyone's getting along, you never know when what you say or what you do will come back to bite you. And even if it's joking or certain, we've gotten to be such PC society here that everything is fair game as to what's harassment nowadays. So then we talk about what is risk, and there are different levels of risk. In the HR area, putting inappropriate people in charge of HR, because you think they're a nice person, as opposed to someone who understands some of the basic guidelines within HR, so that you have more of a personal approach to HR versus a legal approach to HR. Make sure you have internal checks and balances. Again, if you don't act with some issues or you're not following your policies, that can create risk for you. Obviously, if you fail to follow the law, that's a no-brainer risk. And then really trying to make sure you train and oversee managers who are managing other people, and when they're making decisions, that they're making them on what's legal versus their gut reaction. So there are 4 key areas of risk, and the greatest one, I think, for arts organizations and nonprofits in particular is this payroll issue. And I know there was a webinar, I think last month, regarding independent contractors and employees. How we, especially classification of exempt and non-exempt employees, I think is one of the biggest areas of risk in our business. And there are very specific rules and regulations about what makes someone exempt versus non-exempt. There are financial thresholds. One of it, the non-financial, is supervision. Do they have independence in decision making? Are they supervising other people? So you really want to check on, there's again a checklist that you can find, and I'll give 2 websites later, and make sure that you do an audit, internal audit of who's exempt and who's non-exempt, and make that very clear. Because again, if it's non-exempt and you fail to pay overtime, this can really add up to many fines. And nowadays, as you may have read even in the paper recently or in the news recently, that the state of California and some of these agencies are really having extra time to audit organizations because it creates extra money for them because the fines are extraordinary. Even if you use, and we do this a lot in the arts, using employees for volunteer work, maybe you say, well, such and such who's a non-exempt person, maybe it's a receptionist is a great example. Receptionist, that person's job is to be there 9 to 5 and answer the phone, so that's it. But that receptionist also works for you at concerts as a stagehand or as something else. You have to pay that person that extra overtime. And if you don't, you're not in compliance and again could be fined heavily. So the other issue is misclassification, not only exempt and not exempt, but employees versus independent contractors. Many of us like to lean toward hiring quote-unquote independent contractors because then we don't have to pay the tax. But if you, again, there's a whole list of qualifications or that show what's an independent contractor versus employee. Because otherwise, again, you get into meal and rest break issues and reimbursement issues and so forth. The reimbursement for expenses, if you fail to reimburse people and it's in your handbook or you are, be very clear about what you reimburse for and what you don't. Same thing with giving employees things instead of money, housing allowance, car allowance. They have to pay the taxes on that, or the taxes have to be paid by somebody. The next issue is terminations. We talked a little bit before. You have to be very careful when you terminate people. You can't terminate people who are not working at will, who are contract employees. You have to follow that contract. Certainly one of the big issues with arts organizations or orchestras is our union contracts. So you have to follow union contracts there. Also is to make sure that when you terminate, that you're very careful that you're not that you're very clear about the documentation as to why you're terminating, so that people can't say, well, you're firing me because of my age or race or gender. I had one person that was just not doing the right job as a finance person, but she was also 6 to 7 months pregnant, and I needed to get rid of her. But it wasn't because she was pregnant and going to cost the organization money. It was because she wasn't doing her job as a finance person. And but one could make the argument, the employee could make the argument that well, he just got rid of me because I'm pregnant, doesn't want to pay the health insurance or something. So you have to be very careful about documenting that. Whistleblowers, I think we all know the whistleblower rule. You can't just terminate on whistleblower. And even though there's an at-will clause in California, people think that you could just fire people in any way without any cause, and you really do have to show cause, especially because they most likely will file an unemployment claim, and if you fired them with cause, you have to prove that, otherwise you're going to have to pay the unemployment as well. The other thing with termination, which I think we also won't really pay attention to, is that when you terminate someone, you have to pay all of the money owed to them, which includes the vacation or pay time off, any reimbursements. You have to pay them that day. So, and if you don't, every day that you don't pay them what they're totally due, you can be fined heavily. So this is a big deal. So, for instance, if you find someone that you, in a surprise way, you have to fire, and you need to fire them right away, and you don't have all this paperwork done, you have to ask them to come in the next day when you have that paperwork, and then actually pay them for coming in that next day, so that when you let them go, you've paid them for all of their time. This is a very sticky issue that most people don't think they have to follow. They just, but it's a very heavily fined area. And then, of course, I would also suggest, just in general, using the 90-day introductory period. Putting in a period where people can assess the organization, you can assess them, and it's very clear that it might just be a 90-day period that they're working for you. The other issue is self-supervision. We've kind of talked about this earlier. Having people who don't really know or aren't really supervisors or have that kind of managerial approach in an objective way, managing folks. Sometimes you may also have people who are playing favorites, especially for long-term employees might resent the fact that supervisors aren't dealing with the behavior of people at work, and again, you might lose some really great people. But I've been finding that employees are very much like siblings. Everyone's watching everyone else and watching what the mom or dad are doing for their colleague. And it's very interesting. You may not hear about it right away until they've had enough. But again, going back to what is fair and what is equitable is really important to keep in mind, so that you're taking care of that. The last thing is really having policies in place, so that policies are not going to fix everything. Again, creating a culture is, I think, what's really going to fix most things. But having a policy that is current with the current laws, and again, because the laws change constantly, I'd really suggest you have an employment lawyer, not just a lawyer, any lawyer, but an employment lawyer check to make sure that you're not contrary to what the law is saying, or that you can't support in court, and that you have policies that you can enforce. And otherwise, if you don't enforce them, then there's no reason of having policies. Or if you enforce them erratically, that doesn't help. Again, thorough, holistic, fair, equitable, and then making sure that all your handbooks and written policies are all current, and that you don't have multiple copies or multiple versions of those handbooks floating around. And really, I consider looking at this annually, because again, the law changes so quickly that you want to make sure that even if you have a handbook, you don't just rely on that for 5-10 years. Look at it really annually. And I'd also suggest, though, given all this policy talk, that you can't run a business and you can't run a successful culture through a handbook. You really have to. The handbook is really about the details and the legalese and the how-to, but it doesn't really design a successful culture or a successful team just to say that you have a handbook that you're following. Let's see. Moving on. So really the 4 big takeaways regarding preparation and the legal issues of HR is what I talked about before, which is this at will. At will doesn't mean you can just fire anyone at any time without any reason. I mean, you certainly can do that, but it doesn't help when they file an unemployment claim against you. So really, the at-will it needs to be supported by a documentation of why that person needs to be terminated. In your policies, you also have to have a no harassment, and again, it's required in California, and it's very detailed. It's not just sexual harassment. There are all kinds of levels of harassment that need to be in your handbook, and make sure that the employee knows that you're not tolerating certain harassment. And then also a grievance arbitration clause, so that if there are issues, it's spelled out very clearly how the grievance is going to be handled, you know, the chain of command, so that people feel like they have a resource if they have an issue, especially in smaller staffs where you have, you know, maybe 2 or 3, 4 people, and you know, who are you going to complain to if your boss is the one who's directly harassing you or having an issue with? So there needs to be some other person, maybe it's the board chair, maybe it's the head of personnel committee, something like that. And then last, confidentiality, that you really need to have, you know, what's confidential and what's not, what can be used, what can't be. And again, I really suggest that you work through a labor attorney so that you're not just, you know, having a regular business attorney look at this, but the employment law is so strict and so quickly changing. It's really good to get that done by an attorney. And there are, you know, pro bono lawyers out there, pro bono companies out there that will help with this if you don't have somebody actually on your board or connected to you. So at will, again, you know, you can't fire someone if they have a contract. You can't fire them out of discrimination. You can't fire them if you're asking them to do something illegal and they don't do it for you. And certainly you can't fire them if you know, you have a rights like the medical family leave. If you go against some of the legal issues that or rights that you're supposed to be affording employees, you can't just fire them out of that either. Let's see. So move forward. The two big documents that I'd really, if you didn't listen to the rest of this, employee contracts, have a lawyer review your employee contract, especially if it's a contract for a certain amount of time, not an at-will issue, but a real contract, because I've seen contracts even here that were so employee-friendly that it completely tied up the hands of the organization, and you know, you don't want to get into that situation. You want to try to avoid that, especially when you have a new contract drawn up. And then the other is severance agreements. So maybe you have an employee who's been there for a long time, and it would be easier if you have a severance agreement. Make sure that that's reviewed, because you know, that's a legal document that could get you in trouble if you don't do it correctly. So, and then when if you're going to do this, I'd suggest that you have the lawyer who might represent you draw up these documents, so that if you get to a point where you go to arbitration or you're in front of a judge, that the lawyer had buy-in from the beginning. So in conclusion, and I don't really see any questions, I guess I could take some at the end here. There are 2 resources for us. One is the EDD, the California law, and again, this changes constantly, so it'd be a good one to continue to check on. And then the Department of Labor, which is the federal guidelines. The books that I was talking about that I think would be helpful to be able to change culture is Good to Great by Jim Collins, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which I mentioned earlier, and then 2 others that one of which you probably already know, The Art of Possibility, that Ben Zander brought to our conference a couple of years ago. And this Art of Possibility is not necessarily HR, but it's about looking at life and looking at a culture in a certain way, you know, the possibilities rather than the black and whiteness of life. And then another book that actually was written by a presenter that came to AXO about almost 4 years ago now, called Victims, Villains, and Heroes. And he talks about that we all play these roles in the workplace, and we all play these roles in life. we're always the victim, or we're playing the villain, or we're talking about the villain, who's often our boss or our teacher or our parents. And then those of us who overextend ourselves and try to fix everything are playing the heroes. So it's also I think these are 4 good books for those who aren't really professional HR people but want to try to change the culture that they're in. So with that,
Paul?
Yeah.
I have a couple questions. It's Chris. First of all, this was wonderful. This is always, if we don't know all of these issues and points and think about them every single minute of the day, we certainly do. It's good to be reminded of them. I wanted to point out that here at AXA, we've just gone through quite a lengthy process of redoing our employee handbook, and if I think I'll post it on the website if it's not there already. It's very, very up to the minute with everything that's going on in the HR field, and I think people, you could use it as a sample. The other thing I wanted to ask you about going back is the issue of trust with your staff, and can you anecdotally, or can you give us some examples about how you, just walk up to somebody and say, "Hi, do you trust me now?" Or "I trust you." How does that play out in your organization?
It's a good question. It's not an easy fix. You can't, trust is earned, and I think really starting from the beginning is making sure that all the conversations that you're having as a team are about the success of the organization, and don't start with, what's in it for you personally as an employee, or, in the case of a board member, I've seen many board members come on board with, giving gifts or giving advice with strings attached, as opposed to what's great for the organization. And I think really beyond that, it takes time for one to be open to present ideas and be vulnerable to other people. That's really what we're talking about, is being vulnerable to other people, that they won't, that if they have criticism, it'll be because it's best for the organization, not out of personal vendetta. One of the things that is, as far as how you do that practically, again, using some of these books and tools, going on staff retreats and talking about this. I'd recommend a staff retreat even once a quarter, and certainly I have staff meetings every week where everyone's involved. So through ongoing team conversation, that's one way you can build trust over time. I do see a question. I'm having trouble kind of reading those questions because of my viewer being here, the window, but let me see if I can.
Would you like me to read it, Paul?
Yeah, there's one about a board member or something.
Right. So how do you recommend mediation when a board member harasses a staff member in a way that makes the employee unable to get things done, holding up the process, sending hostile emails, etc.?
I guess that depends on, again, the hierarchy. If that board member is the board chair and that employee is the CEO, one could, well, let's handle the other thing. If it's a board member just to an employee, certainly the CEO and the board chair should be the people that employee can go to, and that the CEO should have, the board chair really should be running the board like the CEO runs the staff. Essentially, the board chair is the CEO of the board, and often if I have an issue with board members, or staff members have an issue with board members, I really expect first that the board chair will take care of the situation, obviously within conversation. But if that's not the case, it's tough, because you could seek your own outside counsel to help mediate. I think that certainly
in our handbook we wrote out the process for this. So you're right, not knowing whether the person that asked the question is the CEO of the organization or not. There's a process. She should be able to go to the top dog on staff first and then on to the board. But if she's the top dog, then and if it's just a board member, she should be able to go to her president and have this settled, fixed.
Right.
Help her.
And you know, there's a point where maybe you can't. I mean, it's not a culture, or it's not a hierarchy or organizational structure that you'll be able to fix. And I think that that's also important to know. I mean, if it is a CEO and board chair, you know, what I've done is employ other board members who are of like mind to try to help change the board chair, so that it's you know, you sort of lead legislatively. But there may be a point where, you know, you've tried that and it doesn't work, then it's just time to move on. I mean, there are organizations that remain dysfunctional. Are there other questions? I can't, again, the pane here is so tiny that I can't see all the questions quickly, and my IT skills are not helpful.
Paul,
Oh,
no, I don't see
any
other questions.
I got it. I see. Now I know how to do it. Okay.
Turn the little arrow down.
Yes, got it. Yeah, I think that you know, if you consider really changing the culture holistically, it'll really help minimize so many issues that we have. It's amazing how many issues we have day to day in our work. And you know, I even challenge you all to listen to conversation even as you're walking on the street or at a restaurant, and you can overhear other people's conversation. I've been finding that 50 to 75% of conversations that I hear snippets of, even if I walk by quickly, is complaining about their personal or professional work or life situation, how something's unfair, and everyone's playing the victim. And it's very, very interesting. And I think that instead of complaining about it and being victims, you know, we should really step up and try to do something about that. Even if you can fix your own little circle rather than trying to fix the entire organization, just start with the people that you're immediately connected to and try to develop a culture there, and then develop the culture inside out. I think is really helpful and will make life a lot more fun for everybody. Workshops that are available to help supervisors learn to manage better. There is God, I'll have to get this to you. There is a company that does really excellent presentations, and so the name's not coming to me right now, but I think you can even sign up for like $200 or something for a whole year, and you can go to as many seminars as you want. And I've been to a number of them. They're very, very successful and very professional. So I'll try to get that to Chris and get that out to everybody. Especially because you want to learn from those who are outside of our industry, because I find sometimes our industry is a little insular, and we feel like there are challenges than there really are. Under discrimination, we have policies laid out clearly in things like sexism and so forth. Particularly in our case, the older board members have views of the young staff members that seem inappropriate, making comments like, just this whole "she is just too young" or "he's just too young," belittling remarks. That can create harassment and discrimination. I mean, while there are very obvious discriminations, as you mentioned, sexism and race and that kind of thing, making comments like, "well, you're just too young, you don't understand," does really create even a hostile environment, one could argue. And so that's why I was saying earlier, really be careful what you say and what you do, because it could be used against you. And certainly those board members should be addressed, that they can't talk about or talk to the staff that way.
Yeah, it sounds like this particular board could benefit greatly by having a consultant or someone coming in and talking about, you know, these are important issues, and it could be construed as you know, complimentary that, oh, you're young, you get all of this. But when it's done incorrectly and the employees feel belittled, the board chair needs to get his or her board, you know, they need to get them on this.
What I find interesting a lot, even with my own colleagues, is that we look at the board as this all-powerful being, and you know, we don't want to talk against the board. We don't want to discipline the board, so to speak. I mean, maybe discipline is a harsh word, but you know, the board members, we have to remember, in the ideal situation, staff members are the professionals. They're the ones who are in the front lines, and they should be the ones who are professionals. And the board are volunteer members who may or may not know much about your industry, much about, you know, how to operate. And the board really needs to be, that's why I said there needs to be an agreement between the CEO and the board chair of what that board culture is like. You know, I see oftentimes board members will even innocently call up a staff member and say, hey, could you do this? Well, sometimes that gets exploited, where board members are starting to direct staff members around, you know, the CEO's management, and staff people feel like they have to do whatever the board member says because that's the board member. So I think that you really have to make sure that the board is focused on what it's focused on, and the staff is focused on, you know, what it should be. And that this kind of leads into another question here. When hiring the office, should the supervisor get permission endorsement from the board? Again, ideally, the CEO and or, you know, depending on the hierarchy and how large the organization, the CEO ultimately is responsible for all the hirings of staff. As long as it's within the budget, it's been approved and so forth, I'd say that, you know, the CEOs should have carte blanche on hiring any of the staff. That said, I don't think it needs to be a dictatorship. I think in the ideal sense, you want to have, you know, certain members of your board involved. For instance, we just hired a education community engagement manager here, and I made sure that that person met with our board chair, a number of the board members who are involved in that area, not as a endorsement necessarily or a permission, but more of a involvement, so that they feel like they can weigh in. But at the end of the day, you know, it's the staff supervisor's responsibility and authority to make the right hire. So again, I think that sometimes we feel like we have to divide things up of what's mine and what's theirs, and who can say what and who gets what say. And I think that if we can look at it from a collaborative standpoint, but also know where the lines are drawn, and those lines have to be clearly laid out, obviously. And that's where I say having your board chair involved with that is really important, so that when there are some gray areas, everyone knows how to navigate through that.
Right.
Any other questions that I haven't addressed?
It looks like you have all of them, Paul.
Oh,
Oh, here.
I say when you hire locally, someone you know versus when you should do a national search. You know, I think it's up to you. You can do a national search, so to speak. To me, it doesn't matter. I mean, to me, you're looking for the best person. If you're talking about when do you hire a search firm, maybe that's a different question. But I think that you should again look at what you need. You know, what are the job requirements, and then who's the best person. And whether it's, you know, they're in your backyard or whether they're, you know, halfway around the world, shouldn't matter. Certainly with the internet nowadays, there are easy ways for organizations to do national or international searches just by posting on certain, you know, websites and doing your own search internally. So I think it's just up to what you need and where you find that person. You know, that may change if you need somebody where the position requires they know the community, say like a development person perhaps. It would be a good example where, you know, it would be helpful, maybe not required, but it would be helpful if they knew the area. So hiring someone locally may, you know, give that person the advantage right away. But otherwise, I think it's you can do whatever you want. I mean, that's the beauty of that's the beauty of organizations. You should be able to do whatever you want as long as it is in line with the mission and vision and of the organization.
And the laws of California.
And the laws of California. I mean, that's the thing that other than the taxes, California law, HR law is very, very strict, and that's why it's helpful even to have on your board. I have at least one employment lawyer that we utilize, and it's come in handy because those fees could also add up too.
Okay, well, there being no further questions, I'd like to thank everyone very, very much for joining Paul on this webinar. This is the last one in AXO series this year. We'll start out again next year in October with lots more. We really, really appreciate your time, Paul. This was terrific. And we will see you all at conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you.